Good morning. This is Mako Fujimura, live almost from my Princeton studio. And so great to have you in this conversation. This is the second part that I will be interviewing Joshua Clayton of NYU, professor of computer science, and we're going to have fun talking about NFTs, blockchain, digital technology. But just in case you're sitting there wondering, like, this has nothing to do with me. I'm an artist that doesn't deal with digital images. Stay tuned and think about the overlap. The inevitable overlap today between technology and art. As you know, what I do is very archaic. It's using 17th century Japanese materials mixed with space age materials, as you see behind me. And these works that will be shown at Highline 9 this September. You would think, because I am dealing with Nihonga and traditional art and so forth, that this has nothing to do with digital sphere. Well, that's not true. As you probably have encountered my Twitter and my Instagram site, I was one of the first artists, I don't know if not the first artist to have a website in the mid-90s. A friend of mine who was a student at NYU actually wanted to try creating a website out of sheer coding. So it was built block by block, literally, and that became my entry into a digital sphere. So I have known from way back how significant this territory was. I didn't know what it would mean or how this will play out, but nevertheless, I felt that this was significant enough that I should invest in it. And so many years later, we were dealing with this frontier, still a frontier of digital technology and art. But I think it is a very significant part of what we will do. As we will discuss with Joshua, there's a new paradigm in even how art is marketed, how galleries operate. All these things are new. So stay tuned. And if you have any input, or if you have any questions, please feel free to respond in any of my social media outlets or even here on YouTube. Okay, great to see you, Joshua. Are you back at your NYU office?
Yeah, I am. I spent the month of July visiting family in Michigan, and we just drove back to New York City this weekend. So yeah, it's good to be back, and we'll see what kind of semester this is going to be. We're going to try.
It's going to be interesting in every university. So last time we spoke, there was a construction or something. Were you in another space, or?
Yeah, I'm still displaced.
Yeah.
This is a temporary office, but I should be back in my regular space by the end of the month, I think.
Okay, so I have a funny story to tell you about my father. He was at Bell Labs for a long time, and he went to Ohio State to lead the linguistics phonetics department there. And I got a call from him one Saturday morning, and I could tell like he was really distressed. And I said, "Dad, what's wrong?" And he said, I can't get into my office, and I said, "What do you mean you can't get into? Did you lose like your keys?" And he said, no. They moved me. They were rebuilding the building, linguistics building. So they moved me, and they gave me this office, but I can't get in. The parking lot's like all locked. And I said, okay, maybe you can talk to the security or something. And he said, well, the problem is it's under a football stadium. So his temporary office, the scientist, was displaced underneath Ohio State football stadium. And I said, "Dad, there's a thing, national religion called football, and Saturday is the day games. No, you will not be able to work on Saturdays." And he was like so upset. He was like, why would they do that? Like, what? Like, this is the university. I should be able to get into my office. I was like, Dad, okay.
Oh man.
You know?
And I mean that also just talks about, that also addresses the importance of space, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's good. Like I'm happy to have some kind of space that I can go to right now, but I'm not in my zone right now because this doesn't feel like my space. And the way that we try, I mean, just looking in yours, it looks like you've spent some time thinking about the placement of things. And I mean, even like the red and blue that you've got going on is pretty meaningful. So so I understand, I understand your dad's
Yeah,
situation
no,
there.
and it's interesting. You're right, because that, it's a funny story, but it does tell us about our priorities, right? What makes something, for university more of a priority. Of course, Saturday morning football game is number one, and no kidding. It's not just the popularity of it, it's the economics, it's how you market the university. So it kind of is, it does go into, and it does lead actually nicely into our conversation today, because we're talking about a digital space, which to a lot of people is very vacuous. It doesn't really exist in a sense that, we experience a physical space. But I'm feeling you've been thinking about this a while, I'm sure, and you created pieces for digital space. And how is that, inhabiting a space, what you create in relationship to an actual place, work for you?
Let me approach that in two different ways. One, and maybe we come back to this today or at some point, but I definitely wouldn't want to lose that thread of Bell Labs from the way that you kind of pivoted into this conversation, because I feel like that's an important
Yes, definitely.
node in the network of our conversation right now, and early experiments in art and technology. Technology as kind of like this extension of ourselves. And we started talking, I think, a little bit last month about the technicity of arts in general, and how whether we're working with code or a paintbrush, those all have technological a technological lineage that is part of the conversation. I started making networked, I guess, what I like to call networked art when I was living in Japan, and I feel like that was significant because that was an opportunity for me to make work that is it's not necessarily going to be experienced in physical space, but it was an extension of my practice that allowed me to make stuff that could be experienced at its essence, whether you were in that particular space or you were on the other side of the world. And I think that the web in its early days presented us with that invitation. It wasn't just a space for consumption. I think that's one of the ways that the web has been degraded. Not that there's anything bad with buying stuff online, but when the primary way that you use networked media is to either consume or be marketed to, or have your data monetized, like that becomes a less civil, less wonderful, less exploratory space. And so why not use digital and networked media as a way for creating and engaging with one another, and not just for buying stuff or arguing. And so I feel like so much of what I'm trying to teach, fundamentally, I'm teaching students how to express themselves with code here, but like at the heart of that is a way of working with technology that ultimately is about people and bringing people more meaningfully together, and not just using the technology for the technology's sake, but as new manifestations of our own creative spirit, of our own ability to interact with each other, to interconnect more meaningfully. So whether that's through just hanging out online, or it's through the art making process, there's still so much untapped potential there.
Yeah, you mentioned Japan, and we just ended the Olympics, and they're getting ready for the Paralympics in a time when Japanese citizens were completely against this idea. They felt very much unable to host this Olympics, but International Olympic Committee pushed this through, and would love to hear your feedback, because your wife Sachiko is Japanese descent, and for those of us who have particular ties to that land, we felt the pain of the country, this country that's been going through severe trauma through 3/11 and tsunami and ongoing nuclear meltdown, which hasn't really stopped. We just stopped talking about it. And the economic crisis with, but we see Japan as a kind of an emblem of this futuristic place where nature and technology can co-inhabit, create something new of a paradigm. We see kind of this Blade Runner's kind of sense when we walk around Shibuya or Shinjuku, and this integrated potential. And yet when it came to the pandemic and the Olympics, they just couldn't get over the trauma, it seems. And so, but inhabiting that space for you is important, right? Because your piece reflects that.
Yeah, I also had so many feelings as I was watching the Olympics, especially the opening ceremony, Mako, and I'm sure you did too. And that could probably be our whole conversation today.
No.
But I remember, to be perfectly candid with you, I remember shedding tears when I watched the announcement, I don't know how many years ago now, that Japan was awarded the 2020 Olympics. And it was such a wonderful, it felt like such a wonderful announcement, because this represented an emergence past 3/11, the triple disaster that caused so much pain in the country. And so there was this kind of hope of the Olympics and something to look forward to, a way to welcome the world back. And congratulations to the ways to the country and to the people who made that happen in a meaningful way. I mean, for me, watching the opening ceremony was also emotional, because I have so many ties to the country still. But it was a mix of joy and sadness, seeing the empty stadium, that so many of the games played out with this backdrop of, and wondering, how could this have been different? Could it have been postponed one more year? Feels like it could have been a much more joyful occasion.
Yeah, and it seems like, right, there was so much potential. It turned out they had 5 years to prepare for truly a hybrid Olympic that could carry us into this new century, where things could have been different. And, I even think that, if they wanted to, Japan has the medical technology to tackle vaccination, and they did none of that, right? So you kind of sit there with the Japanese citizens, many of them I'm directly communicating through Twitter live, and the sense that they had was like, oh, please let this thing, get this thing over with, because we're under, we're trying to fight for our lives here, and we just don't have, but anyways, going back to the potential, this inhabiting a space that is, cutting edge technology with nature and culture and history tied in together, it's something that I think NFT and blockchain and cryptocurrency even aspire to, right? There's this ideal about it. It's not just, Bitcoin's value going up. There's something much more in its ethos that probably we need to discuss.
Hmm. Yeah, where is a good point to start with that? That's a great question.
Yeah, I mean, the founder of, this supposedly the founder, the technology that Bitcoin's birthed out of, his name is Japanese, whether that's pseudonym or not, that's pretty significant.
Yeah, that's the ideal, isn't it? This a kind of beautiful coexistence of our relationship to space and to one another. Like, how are we at one with our brothers and sisters and with our environment? Because I think that so much of the rhetoric around of contemporary uses of technology is one of alienation, right? And isolation, and that's not what we're going for. I don't think that was what these mediating systems, I don't think that's what they were designed to do. They were designed to connect us more fundamentally, and when we're losing sight of that, then something's going wrong with this. So I don't think the technology is going to save us, but we can use the technology in a way, whether that's the so-called metaverse, which we can talk maybe a little bit more about today, blockchain technology more broadly, or something else. There's always the opportunity at the onset of these technologies to try to help guide them into more life-affirming, holistic directions. So if that is maybe our small contribution in these conversations, like to advocate for that in the ways that we participate in that space, Maka, that seems like that will be a good thing.
And your work speaks of that, right? You're creating into that gap, and my work as well. And this is a conversation that seems like it's about blockchain and technology and cryptocurrency, but it's really also about how art is marketed. Is art supposed to be a transactional way of gaining power and wealth, and fame, or is it something else, right? And you and I think, resides on the camp that no, art has kind of a transcendent value, that it is a gift. What Lewis Hyde, the poet, talks about the gift economy rather than a transactional economy, and how actually capitalism needs gift economy to exist, because it doesn't have in itself, in a closed circuit, that you can inject new ideas in an old system. So just like the Olympic, the decisions of the bureaucracy were very stagnant, and people felt very frustrated by it, and the athletes were, the intense pressure that is on athletes like Simone Biles and Naomi Osaka, right? This is coming out and saying, no, this is untenable as human beings. We don't have the kind of a communal way of processing this. They obviously are not talking about the intensity of competition, because they've already accomplished so much in that space, but they're talking about sustainability, I think, in terms as human beings and human communities. So not only this conversation has links to all these new technology, but it is about art and community. itself, it seems. And so, I really appreciate your work pushing into that direction. And as I'm trying to do, even though I'm using like 17th century materials, with a space age kind of mixed in, materials mixed in, I'm interested in creating something that is almost intentionally not transactional, you know.
Yeah, and one of the things that's come up, I think, even since we last spoke to Mako,
Yeah.
is that there is a community that's formed around this that's allowed people working with different ways of making images, different ways of creatively coding, that's produced a kind of community. The NFT space has allowed people to connect with one another using those tools that haven't before. And that's one of the things that I'm most grateful about from, since this earlier this year, when it became part of the broader consciousness, is the way that people have been able to connect and talk and share work. And when I look at my Twitter stream these days, I'm seeing so much more art than I've ever seen before, because of all these people who are posting interesting work. Now, that can be in and of itself, like the NFT hustle can be fraught too, because a lot of people are, we talked about last time, a lot of people are trying to make money off of that. And some artists who are doing that, this is their first introduction to selling their work too. And so when you're selling your work, you're putting yourself out there in a very vulnerable way. And it takes it feels like it takes some time to navigate between the value of your work and the marketability, or how much your work sells. And I think that it's probably been a frustration for some folks who dove into the space and put their heart into it, but didn't sell anything, and feeling like that says something about the value of their work. And just to be upfront, like I've been doing this since I've been listing NFTs since March, and it was only this summer that I started to sell my first few pieces. So there was not like an immediate response for my work either. And so kind of thinking through what does that mean about what I'm doing, and then coming back to the place of trusted community, of people who you know and appreciate, and allowing their voice to guide, affirm, or critique the kind of stuff that you're doing. That feels like a part of a healthy ecosystem of operating in this space right now.
Yeah, and there's also the other side is when you're successful selling your work, right? There's this enormous pressure, and both sides. It's all about stewardship and how we manage both, what we have and the potential of what we have, and the success if it passed through the transactional side. And it seems like that's the side that I always tell artists that I mentor, that I'm more concerned about your success. I'm sure you'll be successful. You're very gifted, but because we don't have a paradigm in this culture to talk about, how to, maybe reinvest our success into what we do creatively, into that gift economy space, or to steward that well long term. And I remember as a young artist in Soho, you want to have a show, and you get a show, and then you sell one work that everybody wants, and enormous pressure, right, to go back to the studio and create that same work over and over, and I almost had to intentionally push back that, these voices, including myself. I have to feed my family, and it would be so easy for me to just keep painting the same work and not take risks and grow. And so, you kind of have to manage that. And there was no manual for how to go through these and certainly emotionally. And I can understand these Olympians, struggling because it is, all we talk about is, winning the gold, or, we don't talk about both the failure side, as you noted, the years of practice of discipline, of not, counting whatever it is out there, right? The metrics as the true value of what you do. And also, when you're successful, you kind of get stuck in this in this machinery that now you're responsible for your gallery's success and and so forth. It's an unbelievably important thing you're talking about, because community, right, and accountability and stewardship, these are things that we don't talk about often.
I don't envy young artists who get a huge amount of attention right out of school.
Yeah.
Because there is a lot of pressure at a still formative stage to continue making that work, just like you described, Mako, to continue making that same thing. Yeah. And I had a very similar conversation with a painter friend of mine who lives in my building just last month, in which he almost completely burned out because of that kind of success that he achieved early on, and then just feeling like he needed to keep doing the same thing. And so for him, the solution was to not keep doing this. He ended up deciding, I'm gonna be a gardener during the summer months, and then I'm going to spend all of the winter months in the studio, because that gives me the freedom to continue to do what I really care about and not feel like I have to continue to work in this mold that's expected of me.
That's so beautiful. I echo that sentiment of having something very tangible and physical to tie yourself in, kind of like creating a new liturgy for yourself, and not letting the dictates of the market, drive everything. Because when you are, when you're locked into these market forces, you really don't have the way to grow, literally grow. And, gardening is a great way to be patient with your tomatoes, right? It's not going to grow overnight, and you don't want a tomato that has grown overnight, and so there's this metaphor that is physical, that is in front of you, and that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Who are some of the artists that you feel is compelling or creating into this, particularly in this NFT space that you've been looking at?
Yeah, one person that has really caught my eye over the past month is as a comic American artist based in, I think, upstate New York, who I don't know personally, but her name is Sasha Stiles, and she's just been doing some really interesting work at the intersection of language, poetry, and technology. And I feel like she's one of the artists that represent a very thoughtful approach, first to the Tezos blockchain, and more recently the Ethereum blockchain. She seems to be cultivating a real critical, conceptual, and even spiritual body of work around NFTs, and I think she's just somebody to continue to check out. Her work, I think, is currently on Hicket Nunc and Foundation.
Okay, so we'll post a link to her work. That sounds fascinating, and as you know, I have been following my friend Erica Anderson for many years, and her work. She started to do this digital image GIF per day kind of thing. I think it was almost 5 years ago, and she didn't know what to do with it. She was out art school, and she felt like that was something she wanted to do, and she didn't have anybody except people, this guy people, who was doing the same thing. And when we first met about, I think 4 years ago, she said, do you know about Beeple? And I said, no, I don't. Tell me about him. And he's the only guy who's been doing this for over a decade. And so she started creating these images, didn't know what to do with them. And we have this conversation with, like, what do you do with art that doesn't make any money, you can't get income from? And then all of a sudden people became this phenomenon, and Christie's auction, 69 million piece, and then she started to mint some of her images, so I jumped in there. I didn't know what I was doing, but I asked her, like, how do you buy your pieces? And it's more complicated than just it's not, you can't like use a credit card to buy it. You have to be on Ethereum.
You got to set up your wallet.
And
I just want to pause, and I have to say, like, that is probably one of the most difficult things about being in this space. Kind of it's not cutting edge, but it's still early, right? And so when you say, oh, tell your friends, like, or for example, even worse, like tell your parents or something like that. Like, who's gonna support you when there's like all these steps that you have to go through?
Exactly.
And then worse of all is I've started to work on the Tezos blockchain, and as luck would have it, you cannot buy, for some regulatory reason, you cannot even buy Tezos in New York State right now. So I can't even sell work to people like in my immediate network. So anyway, back to Erica, because I do want to keep talking about her.
And I share that frustration, because the thing that I had to do to go through to buy one of her Ethereum pieces, it was like, oh my gosh, it took me like a week to figure out, like, oh, okay, so this is, and it's not intuitive, right? So it's definitely something that, like, engineers may be able to figure it out, but artists, like, we have no chance. And so Erica actually had to guide me through all of that, right? And so I was finally able to purchase her piece, and I think I talked to you because I didn't know where it was, like, I was, where is this thing? And then she was so kind, because she actually sent me a thank you note, and she sent me this kind of a 3D thing that she created to be part of the piece, right? So you actually get something, tangible, which for me made me feel good about, but anyways, what I wanted to do was go through that process, because you don't really know, right? As makers, we know, like, you can talk about it all day until you actually do it, then and you kind of go through the frustrations of what you have to do to get there. But so these two people we just mentioned, I'll definitely send a link and put a link in here. And another guy is a guy named Stephen Proctor, who is a friend of mine in Oregon, and he has been, he was in Nashville, I think, when he started to create immersive spaces for mega conferences and churches. He worked with Beth Moore, who is a really amazing speaker and Bible teacher, but she does these huge events. And of course, COVID hit, and they couldn't do that. And so he started to create these images that he would take on his drones, that he would take to Iceland and Israel, and he would start to create digital images that you can project, and you can create these fantastic images. I had him design something for my space in Pasadena, and I'm hoping to have him be involved in my December exhibit in Chelsea. But creating something like that, like used to be the only way you can use digital images. And sometimes you create like a file, that you can sell, right, to, churches and conference folks. But then with the blockchain technology, he was also able to mint something, and like you're saying, it took a while for somebody to finally buy one, but somebody did, and so he's just on the cusp, I think, of beginning to enter this phase. But it's an interesting process. A lot of these digital artists began without knowing the reward. And I kind of trust those people because they had to believe, right, that somehow what they're doing was worthwhile when it wasn't anything tangible that you can show on a gallery, and somehow they kind of built this reality around their work, even though it's digital and virtual. It was in a sense more real to them. A place that their imagination at least was inhabiting. And, going back to what we were talking about with Japan, when we live in time when, things are disassociated, when we are in trauma, oftentimes, I remember many times after 9/11, I couldn't remember, I was in the subway, I couldn't remember which direction I was going. Like it was just like, oh, I just got on the train. Okay, I have to look at my time because if it's morning, I'm going to the studio. But if something happens to the brain where it kind of parts of it just shuts down, and I think it's like a survival mechanism in a sense. But and so we have this amnesia, and digital space seems to account for that because it flattens the timeline, and so something that is taken 15 years ago doesn't age in the same way that a physical photograph would. So there's kind of this interesting relationship between time and digital space, and digital artists who are making stuff before it was something that you can market.
Yeah, and some people have been critical of that, like, oh, now you're selling this work. Were you as though there was something about digital media pre 2020 that felt like you were doing it because it kind of evaded. It resisted commodification. And now that the blockchain has made non-fungible artwork or kind of unique, verifiably unique artwork possible, some people have decided to experiment with that. And so that's kind of produced some criticism, like, oh, you were, now that you can sell it, you're just kind of selling it. But I think your perspective is equally true, if not more important to consider. Like, these people were doing it before you could make money off of it. And so somebody like Steven, he's somebody who's been doing this for years, and all of a sudden you might actually be able to get supported, get a little bit of appreciation for this work that you've been doing. Good for you, right? And Steven's, they're coming back to both Erica and Steven, and maybe one of them will join us. One of the things that I want to ask Erica, if she has this conversation with us, or next time we're together or whatever, is I'm curious how Erica, as somebody who has had a decent amount of success in the NFT space, I'm curious how she feels like her work has evolved from those early days where she was just doing these daily GIFs on her own to these days where there's actually maybe even some anticipation for the next piece that she's making and listing for sale. And then getting back to Steven's work as well, I think that touches on the earlier part of our conversation, where we're talking about this relationship between nature and networked media, right? Because in a very literal sense, Stephen is going out there, he's in these beautiful spaces, and then he's bringing them back into, well, in the case of like, I think the Beth Moore conferences, probably like indoor spaces where people are gathered together in an architectural setting. And I imagine these pieces are being projected in a kind of sublime, large format. And so that's kind of interesting too. But the question for Stephen is, does this, or this question, I mean, for viewers as well, is like, you see this and is it fully satisfying, or does that also produce this kind of longing for you to go and take your own explorations back into beautiful spaces, whether that's your backyard or whether that's Iceland or whatever it might be? But that kind of relationship between nature and network doesn't have to be just like a linear one, but actually a cyclical one, where then you go back into nature, you know, in the paradigm of the scriptures, right? It's you go out into the wilderness and you have time to kind of recharge maybe, and then you come back to the city, and that's where you engage and you do work and you interact. And I think for me too, that's a meaningful rhythm of quiet and then coming back into this kind of energy of New York City in my case.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Good points there, because if you, by the way, I would love to have these artists, we can talk to them, but, I think in Stephen's case, he was always contending against immersive experience being a spectacle. He wanted to draw people into more of a contemplative space. So, he would have these silence, total silence. And I don't know if he had images or not, but his whole point was how can you draw to be quiet in the space, right? So that's a huge challenge for somebody who is orchestrating a conference full of, immersive music and experiences. But, I always admire that he would almost transgress against what people wanted, was, constant information and what's next, and this hype of a spectacle. He went the opposite way, and I think so does Erica's pieces. As these loops, GIF loops, that seems to draw you into something rather than almost entertain you. And nothing wrong with entertainment, and going back to what you're saying about people's criticism for setting the pieces and so forth. I mean, that's to me, that's all part of stewardship, right? And to the degree that we're in a marketplace, we need to make hopefully, if we choose to make a living off of our work, we can do that. Some people choose not to do that, and that's as valid. But nevertheless, it's all about stewardship. So what do you do with what you have, and how do you create something that is more enduring than your 15 seconds of fame, as Andy Warhol reminds us. So going back to Bell Labs, right? And
Let's do it.
I remember my father talking about those days, early days of internet, and what they were, and my father was notoriously difficult scientist to work with, because he resisted application. He would always push it toward pure research, and which means it's not immediately applicable, and only 10 years later, AT&T could benefit from this, all sorts of lines of research that he and his colleagues were doing at the time, because it had nothing to do, with application of solving a problem immediately. And yet we find that those are the things that are needed in application-driven technology today. And so I wonder to what extent the art is the same way. to those of us who are perhaps investing more into pure space, to say, well, no, this is not immediately marketable, or this is not something that it will be popular and entertaining and digestible. But maybe 10 years later, some, whole bunch of stuff will come out of this that other people will be inspired by, or, and how, so I'm curious about how you see the interface and role of technology in thinking about that kind of, movement.
Yeah, I just want to pause there and affirm that instinct that you and your dad probably share, because I feel like that's such an important and hard to preserve way of thinking and operating, right? I mean, even for me, coming from an academic context, which is supposed to preserve that, is supposed to be a research institution. I still find it's always tricky to want to make sure that you are that I am trying to lay a foundation in the way that I'm teaching that is not just, when it comes to code, for example, it's not just about the latest technology, basically. Yeah. It's and this comes back to my art and design education as well. I think when I was in undergrad, I was always wondering why we're still trying to learn composition by using black and white plaka on this board as a way of studying rhythm and composition and stuff like that. But man, those are the things that stick with me, and I'm so glad that I wasn't just spending all my time learning the latest ways of creating media or whatever at that time. And by the way, I just wanted to also give give a shout out to another person who passed away since we last spoke, but kind of had this same critical understanding of the relationship between making and technology. And that was the Swiss designer Wolfgang Weingart. Yes. He just passed away, I think it was in July. And I think he was also somebody who was just really critical about the way that technology sometimes shapes the way that we make stuff, because it moves us away from tactility and from actually working with our hands. And Weingart, walked this fine line between using technology and continuing to have some kind of tactical presence. And in that way, he was both very traditional, but also such a kind of but he understood the rules so well, and therefore he was able to break the rules really well. And so when we're talking about the way that we make stuff, if we don't have a fundamental understanding of where we're coming from, then it's gonna pass really quickly, and we're gonna our work is not going to endure. The spirit with which we approach it is going to fade. And so I think that having some interior awareness of your motivations, having some concepts that are deeply informing your thought process, the way that you're making stuff, and allowing yourself to kind of fall back on that over the course of hype cycles or your own experience of not feeling inspired, for example, like that's super important. That's when we need to go back to the wilderness, go back to the countryside to sort of reconnect, and then come back into the space, whether that is the city or whether that is the blockchain, or and try to find our hybrid, try to find our hybrid reality between what's happening in the real world and what's happening in networked interactions.
Yeah, I love it. And next time, next conversation I want to have with you is at Highlight 9 Gallery in September, where these pieces will be installed. And I want to talk to you
Awesome.
about kintsugi. I want to,
Yeah.
we're going to do some kintsugi related Kintsugi Academy launch there. And because, you know, these in between spaces, right? So you have the digital zeros and ones. But you know, artists can use the mechanism, like you're saying, you know, the principles that we can build our art upon, but there it's the in between, right? It's the same thing with scientific discovery. And you know, I remember my father talking about, you know, it's not like you find an answer to the solution that you're posing. You actually you know, kind of something finds you, you know, and you're open to that, you know, that whatever that voice that, you know, speaks through the data. And so scientists are kind of creating, you know, it's not just deducing and you know, inducing something, it's something else happening. And kintsugi, it seems to me, is an interesting paradigm. Kintsugi is this, you know, as you know, venerable tea tradition of mending something with Japan lacquer and gold to accentuate the flow. So that's a very Japanese way of saying, no, imperfections are way in to, you know, something new, something that's beautiful, and something that honors the fractures of our being, you know, and
Brokenness. Yeah.
so we'll talk about that next time. But you know, what I think is interesting is that even though we're talking about virtual space, even though we're talking about, you know, zeros and ones, you know, and machines, and there's this conversation leads into the mediation of that, right? Like this conversation is not just a Zoom conversation. It's about the content of, you know, our friendship, our journey, long time journey, knowledge of each other. That's why it's meaningful, and we're discovering something new together, and so forth. And I hope this will kind of grow into a community, kind of at least an ad hoc community, that we can kind of wrestle with these ideas.
Yeah.
But also, you know, this has a way to get into the cracks, you know, like what are the, you know, fissures and brokenness in technology in our lives, you know, that we need to mend and to make new, pour gold into. And that kind of conversation is, you know, as we started talking about, you know, the difference between transactional part of art world and we don't get to talk about the the market at all, but maybe next time we can talk about. I just had this really fantastic conversation with a Miami-based gallery dedicated to NFTs, and it was a fascinating discussion on what the, you know, actually is connection between physical space like real estate and digital media. But you know, this always to me, the most important part of this is the conversation, you know, and the community. So thank you for journeying with me, you know, this day. And next one we'll do it in New York City, in Chelsea, hopefully.
That sounds great.
And yeah, and you know, we can talk about kintsugi, we can talk about the marketplace. Highlight 9 is an interesting space. It's kind of a new wineskin in terms of galleries, directly tied in with design and real estate. So it's right next to Hudson Yards, and there's there's a lot of you know, in the paradigm shifts happening, I think, in the art world that we can discuss. So I look forward to that, Joshua. Thank you for joining me. We'll put links on these artists that you mentioned, Sasha, and even Wolfgang's work. If there's a link that we can post for our viewers, that'll be great.
Yeah, and I should mention to our listeners, maybe for some broader context, that our conversations are, are never scripted. We don't really
Right.
know exactly where they're going to go. And so maybe kind of like your dad's research, we
Yeah.
kind of try to
Yes.
we allow the connections to lead in unexpected places. And so far it's been pretty fruitful. So thank you, Mako.
Oh, absolutely. And I always think about things like the Ohio State, example, like, if one conversation leads to, like 3 conversations, right? That's generative. So, so I always look for that. And I mean, this conversation, I have like 10 that I want.
Generative is the key word there, I think, for
That's
sure.
right. That's right. So we'll pursue those links. But thank you for this conversation.